Hello, my name is Dawson Saunders, and this is the Composites Alternative Lab assignment for ETM 2080 Industrial Plastics. Pictured here is part number one. The raw materials used for part number one were polyester resin, MEK, which is the catalyst, woven cloth, and chopped mat. Material quantities, 2 ounces of polyester resin, and then it's 6 drops per ounce of MEK, so 12 drops of MEK. Method of measurement was the resin was measured with a measuring cup and the MEK with a dropper. The equipment used were gloves and a brush. The mold condition was for part number one was the worst mold. It was okay. It had a few scratches here and there. Processing time took about 5 minutes for the whole putting the part together, the wet out and everything. And it's a 3-hour minimum dry time. The part defect here is it just didn't cure up. So this wet out was done by putting some resin on the mold surface and then placing the fiber on, placing more resin, brushing it through, placing the mat, placing resin, and then placing the final fiber layer. So on to part two. It's very similar to part one. So the raw material is polyester resin, MEK, woven cloth, and chopped mat. We only used 1 ounce of the polyester resin here. And for part two, reading the resin bottle or can, it said use 18 drops of MEK. The method of measurement was the measuring cup and the dropper again. Same equipment for gloves and the brush. This mold was different, however, it was waxed, so it had no scratches. Processing time for the wet out and everything was, again, approximately 5 minutes. And then you have that 3-hour minimum dry time. This one, the part defects, had some dull spots and some bubbles throughout. For part two, the fiber and the resin was made to almost the exact size of the mark on the mold. And the wet out was a little bit different. Instead of going layer by layer, all the layers were placed and then the resin was poured on and then brushed through. And for our last part, this one actually had a foam cube as part of the product or the part. So the raw materials here were polyester resin, MEK, woven cloth, chopped mat, and the foam cube. The material quantities are 1 ounce of resin and 18 drops of MEK, which was actually left out of the mixture until after the first layer, and then some was applied to the surface, and then 18 drops were put in the cup. The method of measurement was the measuring cup and dropper again, same equipment, gloves and brush, except for this mold was definitely in the best condition. This one has not only been waxed, but waxed and buffed. Processing time was the same on this. The foam cube might have added a minute or so, just trying to get the layers to go around it and be flush to the edge, which they never really ended up being, which brings me into the part defects. Large bubbles, and then there's bubbles on the edge of that surface between the foam and the fiber layer itself. It's not exactly flush against the side, so however, I thought this part, for this wet out, it was the resin on the mold again, and then uh, it was done layer to layer, not just pushed through, which probably saved it a little bit uh, with the MEK being left out. Okay, so now that we've seen all three parts and I've seen the process in making those three parts, this is four of the things I think are a necessary part of the process to ensure a good part. Number one, the mold should be buffed and waxed. That was only done on the third part in the presentation, but I think that piece turned out the best. Um, so I just think all molds should be buffed and waxed. Another thing that was done in the first and the third, but not in the second, is the resin should be uh, applied to the mold before the first layer. It just kind of seemed to help it stay put better, and it started off the wet out a little bit better. Your catalyst has to be present. Um, your part's just not going to work if it's not there, so you have to make sure you put that in, and you can't forget, like with the uh, third product in the video. And then last but not least, wet outs need to be done uh, by layer. So uh, if you look at the process with the second one where it was poured, where the layers were laid down and then the resin was poured on and brushed through, um, that seemed to be not only more time consuming, but not as effective. So wet out should be done layer by layer. Last but not least, this is my take on how to improve the process. So I think there's two tests that need to be run. Test one involves three samples or three parts using three similar molds and varying amounts of MEK until you find uh, which amount works best. One of the things I noticed throughout the video is there was pretty good variation, or not pretty good. I mean, there was really only two amounts of MEK used, but um, with the chart saying 6 drops per ounce, and then with that for that first part we used 12 because it was 2 ounces. Um, that part didn't quite cure, and then the other two cured, but they still had some dull spots and decent sized bubbles. So the amount of MEK is something we need to get dialed in. For the second test, three samples or parts using three similar molds and varying amounts of time to cure. So going back to what I just said with the first part, um, I'm not sure if it didn't cure because it didn't have enough time, or it didn't have enough MEK, or some other factor. But time to cure, it's a 3-hour minimum. But I want to see if maybe you can eliminate some time by it's curing quicker, or if 3 hours is absolutely necessary. And then building off that, procedures to implement. Parts just seem to come so for number one, parts just seem to come out better when the mold was waxed and buffed. It didn't stick at all. It didn't really bring anything from the surface. Or when it was just waxed, it would bring some of that wax into the part. So you got to make sure you buff it off. For number two, with the results from the test, select the proper amount of MEK to use. So going back to what I said in test one, once we get that dialed in, we'll use that amount of MEK. For number three, the wet out is to be done layer by layer. Um, I just think that ways, I think you get a better part. I think it's more efficient. And I think it takes more time to just pour it on and push it through. When you do it layer by layer, you know you're getting every layer evenly. So it should be done layer by layer. What I saw was wrong with the current process and procedures. It was there was a lot of variation for each part. I mean, do you read do you use the amount of MEK suggested on the container, or do you use the 6 drops per ounce suggested on the sheet? So with these tests, what is wrong is you really just need to decrease the amount of variables, because we had 3 parts and all 3 of them came out differently. I don't think one of these parts were perfect, and I think it's just due to simply the amount of variables that are in the procedure. So with that, I think that is the end of this presentation.